Earlier this year, the Prime Minister made a promise to end the war on the motorist and reverse the then forthcoming ban on new petrol and diesel cars by 2030. Here's a reminder of what he said.
I'm announcing today that we're going to ease the transition to electric vehicles. You'll still be able to buy petrol and diesel cars and vans until 2035. Even after that, you'll still be able to buy and sell them second-hand.
And yet, the government has slipped through secondary legislation today that keeps the old policy broadly in place. The legislation known as the Zero Emissions Vehicle Mandate will force car companies to ensure that 80% of their sales are electric by 2030, and if they're not, they pay huge penalties. The government's own impact assessment says the policy will cost a total of £127 billion, equivalent to £4,700 per household. Any company that doesn't meet the threshold will face punitive fines of £15,000 per non-compliant car, which will hit, of course, the cheaper cars the most. Doesn't make much difference to a Rolls-Royce, but it does make big difference to a cheaper mass-produced car. And inevitably, manufacturers would pass the cost on to you, ladies and gentlemen, onto consumers. So this policy will bring a stealth tax on petrol cars. When the Prime Minister announced the delay to the ban in September, he also had this to say.
But I also think that, at least for now, it should be you, the consumer, that makes that choice, not government forcing you to do it. Because the upfront cost still is high, especially for families struggling with the cost of living. Small businesses are worried about the practicalities. And we've got further to go to get the charging infrastructure truly nationwide.
But at least for now, it should be you who decides. But with this secondary legislation, the Prime Minister's aim is vitiated. This new policy is anti-consumer, anti-choice and anti-motorist, but it's part of a much broader unwillingness of the government to overturn the green ideology. Today, it's been announced that the National Grid has activated its fluffy, friendly-sounding demand flexibility service. But what it means is that we failed to provide sufficient energy supply to meet consumer demand owing to green policies. This evening, households will be paid not to use energy in order to keep Britain's lights on because there's a lack of wind and the cold weather boosts demand when supply isn't there. We've failed to use our own domestic energy supplies, so we have become increasingly reliant on unreliable wind power. And it's getting cold, so demand is rising. But there isn't enough wind, which means the grid can't meet that demand. Now, in a normal capitalist society, you therefore increase supply. And the Prime Minister, to his credit, has given new oil and gas contracts to the North Sea. But this will take time, and we haven't used, indeed the government decided not to use, the trillions of cubic feet of shale gas that are under our feet because the moratorium on fracking, which was lifted, was reimposed and would provide a more reliable source of energy. And the grid would not then fail to have the supply to match demand, wouldn't bribe you to switch things off if we were using our own resources. The Prime Minister's announcement in September seemed to hail a shift towards an intelligent and pragmatic, common-sense net zero. But we need to get back to that and reverse the secondary legislation, which, as it happens, can be done on Monday when it comes to the floor of the House as a remaining order, because it undermines his promise. And fundamentally, he needs to root out ideological green policies that risk making us cold and poor.